Actually, this is the richest site for red-listed forest species in Sweden. 550 forest red-listed species has been recorded in this area. So it's a lot of talks about the old growth forest in northern Sweden, and no offense of them, they are fantastic in the way that they are so large and vast areas with old forests that are still there. But I think in Sweden and in Europe we often forget that we have so high values connected to these ancient trees. And we focus too much on this old growth forest talking that we sort of miss the fantastic biodiversity that is still in the temperate zone in Europe connected to these ancient trees. And that is why it's, in my world, it's very obvious that we have to preserve the cultural landscape with these old trees. And that is as important, or maybe in some landscapes even more important, than preserving large intact forest areas. We have focused a lot in Europe and in Sweden in former days in finding forest without stumps, because we thought that this was the most important areas. In southern Sweden that was a very bad thing, because we found often areas that we had the first spruce generation in these forests, and we thought that these forests were the most important. But nowadays we know that these sort of fragments of old oak forests or beech forests are much more species rich and also are holding elements that was in the old temperate old growth forest of Europe. In this particular area, Halltorps and Ekerum, that is north of here, we know that there were an enormous amount of old oaks still in the beginning of the 19th century. And that is why, because the Swedish king in the 16th century, he put a ban on cutting old oaks on the peasant ground, or the ground which was that the peasant could, they could sort of hyra eller hire.
Yeah, tenants, weren't they?
Yeah, they were tenants to they could have state ground, some peasants. But these guys, they were not allowed to cut oaks. But the nobility, they were allowed to cut oaks, but they didn't need to. So it was sort of a status thing that you could show that you had old oaks. And I think that was also the same in many other countries. Mainly there were maybe kings and other rich people that had these ancient trees still, but the peasants hated them. In Sweden, the peasants hated these old oaks because they were standing in the meadows. And the meadows were so important because if you didn't have a lot of meadows, you couldn't get grass for your cattle during the winter, and then you didn't get any manure, so you get bad result on your acres. But in 1830 this was changed in Sweden, the ban, so the peasants were allowed to cut the old oaks that were standing in the meadows and the acres. So we know now that there were millions of oaks that were cut from 1830 and for the rest of the 19th century. And it was the same in Halltorps hage, this area where we are now. So here we could see a stump that is probably from the beginning of the 20th century, maybe 1918 or so. And in this particular oak we got a probe. Probe that we could see that this particular oak had started to grow in the late 15th century. So that means that if it had been alive today, it would have been nearly 700 years old, perhaps. And we had in 1918 there were 35 old oaks still here in 1918, and 30 of them were protected as national monuments. But the 5 were cut. But then we know that at that time 400 of these oaks had been cut during this time from 1830 to 1918. And on Ekerum here it was over 500 of these oaks that were cut. So in 1832, when the last Swedish inventory in this area were held, we know that there were 926 of these very, very big oaks. And now there's only 9 of these protected 30 oaks from 1918 that are living. So today it's 1% still here what we had in 1830. So that is of course a problem when you try to preserve species that really wants these old oaks. So the diversity here is connected to lichens, bats, birds, insects and fungi, of course. And some of these species has died out, so they are not here anymore. That is, for example, the middle spotted woodpecker that got extinct here in the, well, we don't know exactly, but in the beginning of the 20th century it disappeared. And there are some beetle species that we have lost also, but this is the last locality in the Nordic countries for this Cerambyx cerdo that we will talk a little bit more about later on.
But it was quite challenging in here because there are many values associated with oak in partial shade as well as those in full open, which is kind of the normal scenario for many of these old overgrown wood pastures, which this likely is. It was once grazed and there was a period without grazing. So I think there's it's quite interesting that you don't have these kind of conflicts actually, but here it was much more of a difficult line to walk, I guess, and the boardwalks were also one of the issues because it's wet here in the spring, very, very wet, so the compaction and the paths get bigger and bigger when people are coming here too. So for Swedish standards, this is a well-visited site.
And as you say, Vicky, since this area is so species rich, we really had to know a lot when we changed the management, because this area, as Vicky said, it was grazed in former days, but it wasn't that open as you could think, because there were a lot of trees. So the meadows were mainly a little bit up here, because we have this is former seabed,
Yeah.
And then on Öland it goes like this, that you have different vallar.
Different levels where the sea was at.
Different levels from the different seas we have had periods. And the villages were on the other side of this road mainly. So these areas here were grazing grounds, but also next to the villages they had the meadows. So meadows that you should study the recruitment of oak also in the forest. On a bit because we have this, you know, this guy. We made this study. You could see that there had been a chainsaw taking a sample of this tree. So we made this study of, because it's very interesting to see, since many of these red-listed species, they are really connected to old trees. For oak, for example, maybe they start to colonize the oaks when they are more than 200 years old. Then it's of course very interesting to know how old are these guys that are standing here, and how long period of time do we need before they can sort of harbor deciduous forested species, because of the delivery time mainly. For and new also, old trees, if you could say. He said that grazing was very interesting to know for us. So since we made this study, we know that these trees, they are the result of the big cuttings in 1830. Because then the forest opened up and then we had a regrowth of oak. So these are nearly 200 years old now. And some of them start to become hollow, for example, and some of them start to get a bit coarser bark, and that is sort of the start of the type of habitats that these red-listed species often need. But I assume that it will take 50 to 100 years before we have a lot of more old oaks that could harbor the species that are still on these 9 old oaks. So that's why we have made a lot of different strange things in this area and in the project Life Bridging the Gap. That was
The reintroduction.
yeah.
It's pretty easy.
This is why the population is stable.
Very stable from year to year. It's one individual each year.
Physically stable.
This isn't the tree we put it on, is it?
No.
No. Just looking at the pictures.
And in Europe and in Sweden there has been a big discussion of this species as a pest species that kill oaks. And I think this discussion is very interesting because there are a lot of these longhorn beetles, for example, that are very interested in finding trees with bad vitality. And they probably can smell this for kilometers, that these trees are not in a good condition. Because this species lives beneath the bark here and it feeds on, we don't know so much about actually what it's the specific thing they need for growing. We know how to grow them on the lab, but here they probably feed on fungus-infected wood. And it takes about 5 years in Sweden, 4 to 5 years for the larva.
So it's not the cambium layer?
We don't know,
No,
but they, for sure, the larva, when they are going to pupate, they go 10 to 15 centimeters straight right into the
Heart of the
tree.
tree.
Yeah, the heart of the tree. And that is because they want to not be eaten by the Eucalyptus malteus, this black woodpecker. It is very hard on
They
them.
need to get far enough
Yeah,
in.
so. But in this area we have studied the ceramic shadow now for nearly 20 years, and we have monitored the numbers of individuals in different trees that come out as imaginous, the adults. We can see there's a very low population. It's about 20 to 50 individuals each year that we can measure. There are probably more higher up because we only look up onto 4 meters of height. But most of the ceramic shadow have been shown in I think it was a study from Czech Republic actually. That most of the individuals are coming from up to 6 meters. You have find the most individuals. But since we have studied the trees in this specific area, we can see that this tree, for example, was colonized in 2011. There were a lot of females laying eggs on this oak, because this oak then, at that time, was in very bad condition. Now, as you can see, it's a quite good condition of this oak. So in this tree there is a fight between the oak and ceramics. So when ceramics manage to get some holes and so you often get this sap flows coming out. That is a very important habitat for many insects. But I show this tree to you as an example of, it's not that if ceramics colonize a tree, you are not sure that it will die because the tree could get better again and sort of produce so many probably tannins and water that the ceramics larvae die. So it's a fight, I think. But I really think that ceramics is a species like even Plaginotus detritus that lives in the same way. They colonize oaks in bad vitality, and sometimes these oaks die. But the oak vitality that is bad is not bad in the beginning because of cerambyx or Plagionotus detritus, is something else.
They don't cause the problem.
No, they are just going into the tree because it's in bad vitality. And that's a crucial thing if you are talking about pest species, because true pest species, they really can kill live trees like Ips typographus, for example, the bark beetle that we have immense problems in Sweden and Czech Republic and Germany and so on.
It's true for the Agrilis as well, the species.
What?
The Agrilis species
Yeah,
as well, they have a similar story.
Yeah. But I mean, if you understand the ecology, you know that they can smell that it's a bad vitality of this tree. And if you want to preserve the old oaks, you have to find the cue. Why do they have a bad vitality? And often it's damages on the root system and something else that has it could be, of course, high age and so on also. But many times it's something bad that we have made. We need these old oaks to survive in the long run in an area, because that's sort of the stable habitat that they could live there for centuries. But they could also have 1 or 2 generations in smaller oak trees like this one when they are sort of dying. So in this particular oak tree we had a population of cerambyx for a couple of years, and was a bit sad because every time I had this type of guiding I showed this, that the woodpecker had found the larva. They had picked up larva long into the tree, but they fell on the wrong direction. But here also you could find, a couple of years ago I could find larvae from Lucanus cervus, the biggest, the stag beetle. You find females here in the roots.
And I think we talked about whether it was going to survive or not. Then in 2017, it actually had quite a lot more new growth and reasonably good extension growth as well on the new growth. So equally, it's a huge branch up there, which is the only living part. So this kind of balance between how much intervention when a tree actually has relatively little live growth, where pruning would potentially be something that might tip it over the edge. So then you're thinking about other sorts of intervention like cabling or propping, and I think generally speaking it didn't feel that was the right approach in a site like this. Obviously I think given the number of trees that are left and alive, that might change in the future. But the priority that I put for this tree was to ensure it had enough light to favour the live growth that was here. And what you can see the material here, but this was much more dense right around here, added to which you've got this kind of path. It's not too bad in terms of compaction here, but I think that since the clearance work has been done, and I guess the idea here was coming back every 5 years to ensure that the openness was retained some distance away, but not necessarily seeing this as a wide open area just so that there's enough light getting in so that the live growth can have the best opportunity. this is just something I wanted to show you. Reg Harris is an arborist that I work with in England quite a lot, and we've been talking about different ways to try and retain habitat rather than, which is often not what arborists are working on. And these trees have been dead a long time, but this one is, I think, one of the best examples. If you look inside, it's absolutely full with wood mould, up to probably 9-8 metres, and maybe not, okay, but at least halfway up. And if that were to fall apart, we had that tree we walked past, of course it has a different habitat value. So we had a bit of a discussion, Jonas and I, about whether, you know, do we want to slow the process of decay in terms of falling apart? And actually here I think we decided we did, because it's just, there are so many species associated with these standing hollow chimneys. So we put these bands, or rather an arborist put the bands up, because there was other thing about, you know, we don't want to have big machines in here either, because the ground conditions won't, you know, will do more damage than otherwise. So these are kind of techniques that may seem a little bit kind of, I guess, low tech, but actually, you know, may help at least prolong. If it's 20 years, then actually that's fantastic in the scheme of things. We're doing a bit of first aid for nature conservation in these kind of sites, because we do have so few trees. And you can often have discussions, are you gardening? Because of the kind of interventionist approach in that respect. And I think I feel very comfortable with that on a site like this, because that's perhaps what we need to do, because of the history that's gone before, because we've lost 99% of the old trees and all of that succession that you would otherwise have if you had 500 trees instead of 9, which are still alive, and another 40 or so which are dead. So it's just another one of the techniques that we used, and I think it's quite unusual in Sweden to see individual tree management in that way, particularly in nature reserves. You will see quite a lot of it in Stockholm with Daniel, you know, in the urban environment, but certainly out in these kind of places it's much more common to think about populations of trees, and I actually think most often that's the right thing to do as well. Like yesterday at Stenaryd's Änge, we were talking about, you know, the topping of some of those old pollards. Actually the resources would be better spent creating new ones for the future, and you know, not damaging those old trees in that respect. So that's a kind of, it's been a slow journey, I think, having this communication, I suppose, between the balance of individual tree management, which is sometimes essential on a site like this, and also thinking about populations and in the future. And it's where I would see the real benefit of having ecologists and arborists talking to one another, because arborists very often are the experts on the individual tree care, but when I'm teaching arborists, getting them to think about the population, how many other trees like it are around you, and does that, because that has an impact in my mind as to whether you invest in that tree or not. If you've got another 100 around you, well, maybe we don't need to worry. So I think having that crossover between our professions, if you like, lifts us that much higher and makes us a bit more creative in terms of what options we have for management. So Halltorps, I think, is a great place in that respect. It's a very sad place in another respect, because we have so few of these old oaks left. Ola and I visited this tree for the first time, at least for me, it was the first time in 2002. So 21 years ago, and the tree was in fantastic health. I mean, really fabulous health. The leaf area, the density of leaves, the size of the leaves, the extension growth was just amazing. And I'd been here kind of a couple of years in between time, and it had an iron band around it, which was from the 1960s, completely hollow, and you'll see that. And I was on the way somewhere else, and I thought, I've not been here for a while, so I'll stop by. And I was so shocked because the crown was pale green, really thin. The size of the leaves at the outer parts were really, really small in comparison to the rest, and certainly in comparison to the trees in the surroundings. And I rang Jonas, who you met yesterday, because their county board is responsible for this tree, in the car on the way when I was leaving, and said, something's going on with Kvilleken, you need to do something. And they were like, oh, okay, wow, you know. And in 2006, an arborist secretly had cut the metal band around the tree, but then someone sent a welder in, so you know, a Cesta, someone who kind of puts it back together without really looking at how tight it should be or where it should be. So after that conversation, there was a conference a few months later with quite a few people here. So David Lonsdale and Frank Rinn and Mike Ellison, lots of people from some different countries. And I kind of, you know, asked the question, could we take a trip here whilst everyone's here? Because this is such a famous tree, and I'd like to have a discussion about what's wrong with it and what we might be able to do with it. So we spent 2 days here, and it was tomographed from bottom to top. David Lonsdale and I dug soil samples like out from the tree. I took leaf samples and sent them away, soil samples and sent them away. We had such fun. I mean, we did everything that you could possibly think of doing, but all of us were kind of like, you'll see what I mean, but how do you kind of understand the biology and the biomechanics of this tree? Because it's been in the 60s, it's had this band around it, it's grown with that for 50 years, and what's caused the declining health. And yeah, well, that's the background to the story. And the first thing that we asked them to do was to put this fence up here, because people were kind of going in from different directions, and that even if compaction wasn't really an issue, the stones, you saw the big piles of stones as we were driving. There's very little soil here, it's all stones. So compaction of the soil wasn't really an issue, but there were very few fine roots in the soil out from the tree. So the stable, if you like, the anchorage roots were all there and appeared mostly to be alive. So, you know, it was like, what's the story, what's the problem? And we basically, as you would in a situation like this, I think we came to a conclusion that there were several things that had happened which had caused the decline of the tree, and it tipped the balance. So the first being that the band was cut and then reattached, probably too tightly, but that could just also have been that the trees continued to grow and it's got to that point where it's squeezed, because the cambium has grown over the band. You'll see some of it still there in places. Then it had mildew, and had mildew, which was unusual in this area. Then it also had 2 years of tortrix, you know, the moth that eats the leaves, and a drought year. So I think we kind of came to the conclusion that likely is, you know, probably the band was the biggest issue. Then that in combination with these other factors just tipped it over the edge. And I've been out a kind of search amongst arborists for photographs of it between 2002 and 2012. And I've got a couple from 2009. And 2009 it's starting to look a bit ropey, but prior to that it still looks in good condition. So we kind of narrowed down when it happened, but as you all know, it takes a long time for a tree to respond. So, you know, I think to be realistic, to know exactly what caused this decline is always really challenging, isn't it? You know, I think you could just as well stick your finger in the air, but those were the kind of logic. So we decided to remove the band that was the kind of the first priority. Well, this was actually the first priority, information. Because the other thing was, for example, the thinning crown also meant there was greater sun exposure on the cambium on the trunk, and people were climbing on that. So the bark was getting damaged by people climbing on it, so it was getting sun scorched. So, you know, it's like you get this spiral of decline. I think you talked about that, Glenn, that happens. So once one thing had tipped it, then all these other things were starting to have an impact. But it was more important for, I think, for people to understand that actually a tree like this needs help, it needs support, it needs management. You know, we spent the Vasa ship that you might go and see, which is in Stockholm, they spend around about, I think it's 4 million a year or something managing that, and it's a dead tree. And this had no budget of a living tree, probably one of the biggest oaks in Europe. There's a few in England that are about the same size, you know, depending on where you put your measure tape, but it's over 14 metres around. So that's 10 people it takes to kind of stand around the tree. So we took off the band and replaced it with an alternative system, and that was really, all of us thought actually we could probably just cut it and nothing will happen. But it was like, who who's got the balls to do that and not provide any alternative, you know? So John Hartle put in a system which I think is a really neat system actually, because it's adjustable and it sticks out from the tree, and we used the tomograph to identify where the live areas were for the bolts to go in so that they would be able to sit securely. And as I said, they're adjustable. We used a kind of organic folial seaweed spray on the leaves to try and kind of boost. It seemed like they were a bit low in manganese, and that was one of the things that I felt like this is proper first aid, you know, but what have we got to lose? And I think that was pretty much all we did actually, because mulching didn't really feel that that was the issue, because the soil was in really good condition. The soil is as old as the tree, if not older here. It's never been ploughed. It's been pasture all the way along. You can tell that by all the stones. So you can't plough, no. And it was interesting when we did some of the soil sampling. I tried to get the biological data as well, but all the comparisons are with arable soils or with fruit trees, or actually we're in Småland where the pH of the soil is normal when it's about 4.5 or 5, you know. So you can't grow stuff in it normally, but oak grows in it, you know. So getting some of those information was tricky. This is, as I said, I think we did the work in 2013, so it's 10 years now. And I think the only other thing that was done, it's got all sorts of chains up in the crown as well from the past. It's a proper kind of arboricultural, archaeological monument as well. I think we actually removed a bit of dead wood, which is unusual on a tree like this, just because it was sitting above the only live branch. So what we were worried about was if that fell, if it took the only live branch with it. Yeah. So that was a small amount that was actually removed and put back inside the trunk of the tree in order to kind of encourage this, you know, a bit of, if you like, natural mulching. We wrote a whole big long report on it, but you know, that in English as well as in Swedish if you're interested, and I can send it to you. But the summary of it has been as pretty much, you know, 5-minute summary of what we decided. We've had lots of other people visit the tree. Sorry? I don't think it is, but we'll have a look.